And I decided on a book called 13 Ways of Looking, which is based on the Wallace Stevens poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And I basically what it was a book about video surveillance in New York. I'm resurrecting it now as a short story, but to cut a long story short, I would wake up in the morning and it didn't fascinate me. It felt like work. And I was finding all about video surveillance and vectors and angles and all sorts of things, but I wasn't getting up in the morning and being other. I was being myself. And one of the great values, I think, of the literary experience is to wake up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, I'm glad I don't have to spend the next 24 hours with you. You know? I can become someone else. And at the time, I had a particular obsession with a story that was always kicking around the back of my mind, but I didn't know how to get at it. And that was that Frederick Douglass had gone to Ireland in 1845, and this was the genesis of the novel. And you know, crowds had gone out to see him, and the more I thought about it, the more contradictory it became. You know, it's a sort of a beautiful story about a 27-year-old black man, a slave, still a slave. You know, he writes a book that becomes seminal, not only then but certainly now. A narrative of the life of a slave, and he goes to Ireland, and he goes in preparation to go to England, really, and he goes for 4 months. And he says, when he's in Ireland, here I am under the emerald skies, I can breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. I thought, wow, isn't that fantastic? But the more I started to think about it, the more I recognized that that story was fraught with some difficulties too, because he was there at a time as a guest of the Anglo-Irish and the British in Ireland, and the famine, the Irish famine, was unfolding at his feet. And he had to hold these contradictory ideas in the palms of his hand and deal with them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, I hope. So I loved that notion, right? And I wanted to write about Douglass, and I started to write about Douglass, but I didn't know where I was going. And the process of being a writer, it seems to me, is that sometimes you're a bit like an explorer, and you don't know where it is that you're going to go. You sort of cast yourself out. You want to find a new land. You want to find a place that nobody's seen before. You want to find a place that nobody's really inhabited before, whether that territory be the territory of the human heart or human imagination or human invention. But you don't know how you're going to get there, and you won't really know where it is until you stumble upon it. And in that sense, it feels like you sort of cast yourself out, and you have to trust that eventually you will get somewhere. So I was working on Douglass, and then I started thinking, but why am I interested in this man, Douglass? I mean, what relevance does it have to today? And then I started thinking, what if I were to tell an Irish story today, a transatlantic Irish story in particular, what would I want to talk about? Well, there are two major things that are happening in Ireland right now, and I have done for the past 20 years. First of all is the rise and fall of the Irish economy, the Celtic Tiger. I bet there's more than a few Irish people here tonight, I can tell. And the other thing was the great story of our times, and that was the peace process, the achievement of the peace process. And that was down to one great man by the name of Senator George Mitchell, who was able to harness all sorts of creative storytelling energy in Ireland and help us to bring ourselves together and achieve a spectacular peace after 30 years of terrible warfare, and or 700 years of terrible warfare, no matter how you choose to look at history. So I knew I wanted to write about Mitchell. And I actually wrote to him and said I wanted to, if I could I write about him? And hopefully I'll tell you some stories about that process later on too, because that was kind of funny. Writing to someone saying, "Excuse me, I want to make a fiction of you." And his wife in particular was very funny. She said, "George, She said, "You've written 3 books about this process, and nobody has read a single one. Why don't you let this fella take a go?" So I knew I wanted to take a go, but that's a big gulf between 1845 and 1998. There are 2 American statesmen, two men who are making these transatlantic journeys, spectacular transatlantic journeys. They're carting their own history into my country, and so the similarities there. But then I began to think, well, what would happen if I found something in between them that would make a sort of a link, a chain link towards these things. And then I started thinking around this and said, but that's quite obvious. It should be the very first transatlantic flight, which was done by 2 RAF men in 1919. I'm going to read you a little bit about their. And if people have read the book, you know the end of this particular section. But all right, so they're in what basically amounts to a boat or a crate of air and petrol and 2 Rolls-Royce engines, and they're about to approach Ireland after almost crashing and after 16 hours of flying. Can you imagine open cockpit? Can you imagine anybody today? I complain about my chicken when I go on like the flight from New York to Aer Lingus. This chicken is cold, you know. Imagine these guys were up there freezing. The tip ends of their hair was freezing, and the open cockpit and snow coming in on top of them and everything like this. So here they are coming in towards Ireland. He can feel it rising up in him, the prospect of grass, a lonesome cottage on the horizon, perhaps a row of huddled cattle. They must be careful. There are high cliffs along the coast. He has studied the geography of Ireland, the hills, the round towers, the expanses of limestone, the disappearing lakes, Galway Bay. There'd been songs about that during the war, the roads to Tipperary. The Irish were a sentimental lot. They died and drank in great numbers, a few of them for empire, drank and died, drank. He is screwing back the lid on the flask of hot tea when he feels Alcock's hand on his shoulder. He knows before turning around that it is there, as simple as that, rising up out of the sea, as nonchalant as you like, wet rock, dark grass, stone, tree, light. 2 islands. The plane crosses the land at a low clip. Down below, a sheep with a magpie sitting on its back. The sheep raises its head and begins to run when the plane swoops. And for just a moment, the magpie stays in place on the sheep's back. It is something so odd that Brown knows he will remember it forever. The miracle of the actual. In the distance, the mountains, the quiltwork of stone walls, corkscrew roads, stunted trees, an abandoned castle, a pig farm, a church. And there, the radio towers to the south, 200-foot masts in a rectangle of lockstep, some warehouses, a stone house sitting on the edge of the Atlantic. It is Clifton then, Clifton. The Marconi Towers, a great net of radio masts. They glance at each other. No words. Bring her down. Bring her down. They follow their line out over the village. The houses are grey, the roofs slate, the streets unusually quiet. Alcock whoops, shuts the engines, angles in, flattens the Vimy out. Their helmets applaud, their hair roars, their fingernails whistle. From out of the grass, a flock of long-billed snipe rises and soars. It looks to them like a perfect landing field, hard and level and green, yet what they don't notice coming down are the nearby slabs of peat that lie like cake, the sharp cuts in the brown earth, the lines of wet string that run along the banks, the triangular ricks of earth off in the distance. They miss, too, the wooden turf carts that lie weathered and rain-pocked at the side of the road. They miss the angles of the slains leaning up against the carts. They miss the rushes grown long on the abandoned roads. They bring the Vimy towards the ground, a flawless trajectory, almost as if they could lean out and scoop the soil in their hands. Here we are. The plane suspends itself a foot from the ground. Their hearts thump in their shirts. They wait for the moment of touch, skim the top of the grass. They hit and bounce. We are down. "We're down, Jackie boy." But they know straight away that they're slowing too suddenly. A wheel maybe, a burst tire, a snap of tail fin, no cursing, no shouting, no panic. But a sinking feeling, a dip, and then they realise it is bog, not grass. It's like, welcome to Ireland, lads. They're British after all, so it's like you have to give them some sort of welcome. The living roots of sedge, they are skidding across a green bog. The soil holds the weight of the plane a moment, and they skid 50 feet, 60 feet, 70, but then the wheels dig. The earth holds, the vimy sinks, the nose dips, the tail lifts. It is as if they've been yanked backwards by surprise. The front of the vimy slams into the soil. The back end flips. Brown smashes his face on the front of the cockpit. Alcock pushes back against the rudder control bar and bends it with pure force. A shot of pain through his chest and shoulders. Good Jesus, Jackie, what happened there? Have we crashed? Okay. Oh no, please, you don't have to clap. That's very kind. No. Okay, jumping forward, and you've got to say, how in the world did these three stories, how do they get tied together? Well, hopefully I get a chance to explain some of that too. This is Frederick Douglass's own words for the first 7 lines, and then just a little story about him being in Dublin. Excuse me if I use the N word, but I'm going to do it because, it's literature, and it's not. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. Now, in the long curve of this journey, I find myself spinning a new strand, and I appeal to you, gentlemen, to strive against the despotism, bigotry, and tyranny of those who might refuse me entry into this very room. At the end of his second week, he wrote to Anna that he hadn't been called a nigger on Irish soil, not once, not yet anyway. He was hailed most everywhere he went. He wasn't yet sure what to make of it. It baffled him. There was something crystallizing inside him. He felt for the first time ever, maybe, that he could properly inhabit his skin. There was a chance that he was just a curio to them. But something in him felt aligned to those he met, and in all his 27 years, he hadn't seen anything like it. He wished she could be there to witness it. It was a cold, grey country under a hat of rain, but he could take the middle of the footpath, or board a stagecoach, or hail a hansom without apology. There was poverty everywhere, yes, but still he would take the poverty of a free man. No whips, no chains, no branding marks. He was, of course, travelling in high company, but even on the roughest streets he had not heard any vitriol. He attracted a ferocious stare or two, but perhaps it was also because of the rather high cut at the back of his coat. Webb had already told him that he could perhaps afford a tad more modesty. Now, I was going to read a little piece about him ordering a coat, but I think another piece where he meets the famine might be more appropriate for tonight. They're in a carriage. He's with Richard Webb, his publisher. They're on their way south. He's gone out of Dublin, and things are about to start to change. It is the time of that notion of self-reliance, Emersonian self-reliance, and everybody, and particular, this is very important to Irish history, that, the British government would say, well, they must be able to look after themselves, and this is a lot of where the famine actually came from. Even though in Ireland we were producing more than enough food to feed our own country 3 times over, all of it was being exported at the time. So it's all very complicated, but this is where he meets the famine. Douglas gripped Webb's arm. Webb looked ill, a paleness at his throat. He did not want to talk. There was a smell out over the land. The soil had been turned. The blight had flung its rotten odour into the air. The potato crop was ruined. It's all they eat, said Webb. But why? It's all they have, he said. But surely not. For everything else they rely on us. British soldiers galloped past, hoofing mud up onto the hedgerows, green hats with the red badges like small splashes of blood against the land. The soldiers were young and they were frightened. There was an air of insurrection about the countryside. Even the birds seemed to howl up out of the trees. They thought they heard the cry of a wolf. But Webb said that the last wolf had been shot in the country a half-century before. Creeley, the driver, began to whimper that perhaps it was a banshee. "Ah, quit your foolishness," said Webb. "Drive on." "But, sir—" "Drive on, Creeley." At an estate house they stopped to see if they could feed the horses. 3 guards stood on the gate, stone-carved falcons at their shoulders. The guards had shovels in their hands, but the handles of the shovels had been sharpened to a point. The landlords were absent. There had been a fire. The house smouldered. Nobody was allowed past. They were under strict instructions. The guards looked at Douglas and tried to contain their surprise at the sight of a Negro. "Get out of here," the guards said. "Now." Creeley pushed the carriage on. The roads twisted. Hedges rose high around them. Night threatened. The horses slowed. They looked ruined. A gout of spittle and foam hung from their long jaws. "Oh, move it, please," called Webb from the inner cab where he sat knee to knee with Douglas. Under a canopy of trees, the carriage came to a creaking stop. A silence pulled in around them. They heard a woman's voice under the muted hoof shuffle. It sounded as if she was invoking a blessing. "What is it?" called Webb. Creeley did not answer. "Move it, man, it's getting dark." Still, the carriage did not budge. Webb snapped the bottom of the door open with his foot, stepped down from the inner cab. Douglas followed. They stood in the black bath of trees. In the road they saw the cold and grainy shape of a woman. She wore a grey woolen shawl and the remnants of a green dress. She had been dragging behind her a very small bundle of twigs attached to a strap around her shoulders, pulling the contraption in her wake. On the twigs lay a small parcel of white. The woman gazed up at them. Her eyes shone. A high ache tightened her voice. "You'll help my child, sir?" she said to Webb. "Pardon me?" "God bless you, sir. You'll help my child." She lifted a baby from the raft of twigs. "Good God," said Webb. An arm flopped out from the bundle. The woman tucked the arm back into the rags. "For the love of God," she said, "the child's hungry." A wind had risen up. They could hear the branches of the trees slapping each other around. "Here," said Webb, offering the woman a coin. She did not take it. She bent her head instead. She seemed to recognize her own shame on the ground. "She's not had a thing to eat," said Douglas. Webb fumbled in his small leather purse again and held out a 6-penny piece. Still the woman did not take it. The baby was clutched to her chest. The men stood rooted to the spot. A paralysis had swept over them. Creeley looked away, and Douglas felt himself become the dark of the road. The woman thrust the baby forward. The smell of death was overpowering. The real downer. George Mitchell. I'm going to leap forward to George Mitchell, and hopefully I'll be able to, I'm as interested in the idea of creative reading as I am in creative writing, and I love when people, make all these, make the connections themselves. Often I think my readers are a lot more intelligent than I happen to be, and whenever they say something really smart about a book, I say, yes, that's right. And I steal it and But one of the things that I really wanted to do after I had gotten in contact with George Mitchell and spent some time with him, and imagined him first, in fact, and then spent some time with him afterwards, was to write a very small myth for the Irish peace process. In that myth, I wanted to capture what it was like for him as a 64-year-old man who was in a new marriage, who had a new baby on the way, going back and forth across to Ireland 50 times in 3 years, 50 transatlantic flights, over 300 flights in total, to help negotiate our peace. This is a man who could have been anything. He was asked by Clinton to be in the Supreme Court, you know. He could have been chairman of Disney. He could have done all of these different things. Instead, he decides to give up his time, and he's working for a law firm in Washington, D.C., to give up his time and to go to Ireland. And you think now Senator Mitchell that he really has a deep Irish background, but in fact he was more Lebanese than he was Irish. His mum was Lebanese. His father was Irish American, but had been raised by a Lebanese family too, and he had been adopted. And the more I think about it, the more I think this is one of the greatest acts of grace and courage and decency that has happened, certainly on the American political scene in years. And the one thing that happened to me with writing this book, I had to try and imagine what it was like to be Senator Mitchell. The greatest criticism that came of the book came in Britain primarily because they said there's no way that an American politician could be this nice. I'm serious. It was like as if British politicians are the paragons of virtue. And it is kind of extraordinary to think that there's somebody like him around on our political scene. He is an absolute gentleman, sort of New England, old world grace and about him. But I will tell you that after I wrote the piece, I've gotten to know him even more. And the one thing that I would do is make him even nicer in this particular piece. And the one thing I did miss is that he has a sense of humor. But it's a hard one to get until you spend a lot of time with him, and so I would actually maybe if I were to change the piece, which I don't want to do, I don't ever want to do, it's done. I would say more about his humor and the way that he deals very, very well with people. Anyway, this was written primarily, I suppose, for him, but I wanted to create a myth for the peace process that had certain American overtones. So you'll see a grain silo, but there are also plenty of grain silos in Ireland as well. He was listening to us go on and on. The Irish go on and on, as you can see. You won't shut me up now for the next 2 hours. But can you imagine what it's like to go to Northern Ireland and sit in these plenaries and listen to people day after day after day? In fact, they nicknamed him Iron Pants because he was able to sit and like listen all the time without reacting. And that was his great thing. He listened beautifully. But to listen to us go on, for 700 years, Mr. Chairman, they've been doing this and this and that. But then he pulled the peace trigger and he said, okay, by next Easter, by Good Friday, we'll have an agreement. And we did have an agreement. It's been shaky. I wrote a thing about it last week in the New York Times, but I still think it's there. So it is as if in a myth he has visited an empty grain silo. In the beginning he stood at the bottom in the resounding dark. Several figures gathered at the top of the silo. They peered down, shaded their eyes, and began to drop their pieces of grain upon him, words. A small rain at first, full of vanity and history and rancour, clattering in the emptiness. He stood and he let it sound metallic around him until it began to pour. And the grain took on a different sound, and he had to reach up and keep knocking the words aside just to get a little space to breathe. Dust and chaff in the air all around him from their very own fields. They were pouring down their winnowed bitterness. And in his silence he just kept thrashing, spluttering, pushing the words away, a refusal to drown. And what nobody noticed, not even himself, was that the grain kept rising and the silo filled. But he kept rising with it. And the sounds grew different, word upon word, falling around him, building beneath him. And now, at the top of the silo, he has clawed himself up and he has dusted himself off. And he stands there, equal with the pourers, who are astounded by the language that lies below them. They glance at each other. There are 3 ways down from the silo. They can fall into the grain and drown. They can jump off the edge and abandon it, or they can learn to sow it very slowly at their feet, which is what one hopes we are actually doing. One last piece. So how is it all held together? It's held together with the narrative of 4 generations of Irish and American women. And one of the things that actually Mitchell taught me was, you know, the women on the ground. He said it was always the women that I would go to, and I would find that they had a hope. Even the canteen ladies, you know, they would say to him, "You have to do it for us, you know, Senator Mitchell. You have to." And the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland, the political coalition, they never got as much play as what they should have. But it was people on the ground who were supposedly anonymous in history. And this is part of the construction of my book. The book is largely half male at the beginning and non-fictiony. Second half is sort of female and definitely fiction. But these two things fold over and become one another. And what I'm trying to say is that the real is invented and the invented is real. I come upon a woman, Lily, who works in Dublin as a maid. She comes to America. She becomes a nurse in the Civil War. She loses a son. And then she meets a man who farms ice. And this was a great discovery for me. When I was researching the American Civil War, this whole thing about PTSD was in the back of my mind. I've been reading a lot about it for contemporary soldiers. And I found that in the Civil War, they would take soldiers who were going through trauma, and they would put them in baths of ice, and they would submerge them. And they'd actually hold them down for minutes on end, right? And then they'd come up and they'd supposedly be cured of their shock. I thought that was wild, right? Really wild stuff. But then I started thinking, wow, hold on a second. Where in the world was the ice coming from in the 1860s? You know, pre-electricity. It's not as if they could go to their Frigidaire and go ding, 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 ding. And then but I started to look at ice and the whole notion of ice. And then, like in places like New Orleans, people were having cold drinks, cold mint juleps in the middle of summer. How in the world did that happen? Well, people farm ice. And so this woman, Lily Duggan, becomes a farmer of ice. And this is just a very a page and a bit about her farming ice. And then we'll move on to questions. As soon as the cold came, the lake began to freeze. John Ehrlich rose and he dressed in the faint warmth from the stove and went quietly from the cabin and tested it every day. When the ice was 4 inches deep, it was capable of holding a man. He walked from one side of the lake to the other, staying close to the shore at first. Lily watched him diminish in the distance, tall and thin, his limp growing smaller. A fierce wind blew across the bankside snow, kicked small eddies into the air. The trees made a dark run into the flat distance. He brought his oldest sons out to join him. Father and sons turned and turned, testing the strength of the ice, falconing, he called it. They circled closer to the edge of the lake. Each time they reached the end of a spiral, John Ehrlich raised his boot and stamped to check the thickness. Lily watched the 2 older boys, Adam and Benjamin, do the same thing. The clean thud of their boots broke the silence. She thought they might disappear under at any time, that the lake would take them and ice over, swallow their scarves, their hats, their face wrappings. But they circled inwards, meticulous in their patterns. They knew the depth of the ice by the sound of their boots. They went out the next morning to begin sinking the lake. John Ehrlich used a long, thin auger to bore the holes, steel with a sharp point. When he turned the handle, it looked to Lily as though he were churning butter. Small sparks of ice rose from the surface. He went across the lake with the boys, sinking hole after hole in the ice 3 feet apart. They made a checkerboard of the lake. They stood over each hole and inserted a thin stick to make sure the drill had gone all the way through. The water gurgled up and spread. Layer upon layer, the spill from each drill hole met its neighbour, a spreading sheet of freeze. As the days wore on, they followed their own footsteps back across the lake and re-broke the mouth of the ice on each of the holes. The water rose again. Lily brought them lunch on the lake, hunks of bread and ham, bottles of milk corked with toweling and string. John Ehrlich drank and drew his sleeve across his mouth. Adam and Benjamin watched their father, and they did the same. Soon, Lawrence, Nathaniel, and Thomas joined them on the lake. They came inside to the cabin where Lily had built up the fire. John Ehrlich washed in the basin, then sat down by the light of a lantern. He was a man of 2 lives. He slipped on his spectacles and read aloud from the book. Late in the evening, he and Lily walked out together to see how much the ice had deepened. They wore no skates. They did not want to score the ice, although John Ehrlich knew they would be planing it later on. They rebored the ice, and it deepened day after day, season after season. When it snowed, the process was quicker, and there were nights when the ice could deepen by a full 3 inches. The dark of their figures moved across the enormous white. When the lake was thick enough, they drew a heavy wooden frame behind them. The frame was shod with a sleeve of steel. The snow built up and collected in furrows. Row upon row of them appeared on the western edge of the lake. They looked to Lily like so many white eyebrows. When the snow was cleared, John Ehrlich and his son planed the ice down. They measured out large squares, each the size of a half door. They cut into the lake with an ice plough. The blades were set in grooves, and the plough was drawn by the draft horse. Particles of ice shot up in the air. And when the lake was deeply scored, they bent into the work of sawing along the ploughed lines. The best ice was the colour of crystal, hard and pure. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if that gives you a full sense of how all these stories come together, but I don't want to take away too much if you're still in the process of reading. So do we have any questions or comments? Hi.
So I've read like where I got my free copy today, so I'm going to read this. What like motivates you to make all these like connected stories with like multiple characters? Like why do you always, or at least why in these books do you choose to do that?
So did everyone hear the question? So what motivates me to write these books that have all these, at least in these 2 books, have these characters that are connected? Well, in one way, on a very simple level, I think we are deeply connected. I think we all know that there is a meaning to what we do, or we have to believe at least that there's a meaning to what we do, and that what we do is valuable, and it has to be valuable outside of oneself. It has to be valuable to others. So in that way, we are all sort of deeply connected. And then, so the actions that we have are, we're responsible for what goes on. So I'm interested in talking about that. And in another sense, I like the symphonic idea. I like the idea of the city. I like the idea of multiple perspectives. I like the idea that literature is democratic, and that to truly see a particular event, it's often a good idea to see it from multiple different angles. So John Berger says that never again will a single story be told as if it were the only one. And I really love that notion. There's lots of ways to tell a story, and there's always at least more than one truth. Sometimes two truths, 3 truths, and that you can hold them in the palm of your hands at once. We refuse that in the contemporary condition, I think, is that we refuse to believe that there's more than one truth. And I think that gets us into all sorts of trouble, including wars and so on. But I like mixing things up for myself and writing from lots of different perspectives. Thank you.
So on that note, what is your process, your mechanical process, once you have all these little sparks, of keeping them together? Do you have a colored pen or a big blackboard and cut it on, or note cards, or in this modern age?
Right.
How do you do that physically?
I know lots of writers who will have big sheets on the wall, and they'll have note cards, and they'll move them around and do all sorts of things, and and I'm a mess in my life. And I got you should see my office. I lose things left, right, and center, but the only thing I can hold together is I can hold the story together in my head. So it's all in my head, and it just it starts to take shape there. The physical processes, I mean, my best day would be that I get up at 4 in the morning and, before the kids wake up or anything like that, and write for a couple of hours in what I call dream time, before I check the soccer scores from the night before or something like that. Then kids, Alison and the kids would get off to school and stuff, and then I come back in and work until noon maybe, and then go for a run. I have a very boring life, actually. It's like I have a little dog, a little border terrier. I run around the reservoir, and I live in the city in New York. But my adventures now, I had lots of adventures when I was a kid. As I said, took a bicycle across the United States, and I walked across Ireland and stuff. Now my madness is lived out in these new characters, and that's the process for me.
Please tell me a little bit about your road to becoming a writer.
So my road to becoming a writer. I was asked a question in an interview just before we started, when was the first time you knew that you were a writer? And I don't really know when it was, except I will tell you this. There's a couple of moments from when I was a kid. My dad was a journalist. He was a journalist with the Evening Press, and he'd also been a soccer player, a professional soccer player in England before that. And he'd come back to Dublin. I was raised in Dublin. Anyway, he would go out to the side shed, and I'd hear him battering away on a typewriter. And then one day when I was, I think I was 9 years old, I was either 8 or 9, he came out of the shed and handed me this sheet of paper. And it was a book called Goals for Glory, which was a kid's soccer book, and he wanted me to read it. And so I read it, and he said, "What do you think?" And I told him, "God, this was great, and I didn't like this." And so I was really editing for him. And of course, I didn't think of it like that. But a year later, that book was published, and it was quite successful in Ireland and in England. And there was our teacher, Mr. Kells, who was the 4th class teacher, so I must have been 9. He read the book on a Friday afternoon. If we'd behaved ourselves, he would read the book aloud to us. And one time when Georgie Good, who was the character, scored a goal, I remember this red-headed boy, Christopher Howlett, jumping up onto the desk, right, and celebrating because Georgie had scored a goal. And I remember distinctly thinking, that's weird. Because my dad was out in the shed now writing this thing, and now this boy is jumping up in the air on a desk, and what a process that is. And so perhaps the magic of story, I wasn't conscious of it then, but perhaps the magic of storytelling got to me at that stage. Another time I went to see my grandfather in London. He was in London, we were in Dublin, and he told me stories about how he had grown up, and he was an old drunk but he was full of great stories. Told me stories about the Spanish Civil War and all sorts of things. And of course, until my mid-20s, I always thought that he'd gone off with the Internationale and everything like that. Then I found out he was a brown shirt, it was like a fascist, But the magic of storytelling was always around. I had good teachers, I have to say. I know I'm playing a little bit to the crowd, but I really love libraries. My book Zoli was dedicated to librarians and to people who have libraries, but teachers too, and there are teachers in my family. It's so important, to have these people in our community. They're the glue that hold us together in so many ways. And then later on, I just became a journalist and sort of naturally fell into storytelling. Over in the corner there.
Are there any writers, any Irish writers in particular that influenced your work?
There was loads of Irish writers that influenced my work. Later on, I suppose I didn't have Joyce as much as I should have in my teens. I had Kerouac and Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and all those. It wasn't until my 20s that I had Joyce. Joyce is a huge influence on me now. But I will tell you this: if you get a chance to read a guy called Benedict Kiley, and the collected stories of Benedict Kiley, he is absolutely incredible. And he was a friend of my father's, and I used to go to his house and knock on the door around noontime. When I was 16, 17 years old, I shouldn't be saying this in front of 16 and 17-year-olds, but then he would sit there, bring me into the house, show me what he'd written that day, and then we'd go off for a nip of whiskey down the pub. And I would listen to his stories, and he was truly, truly, truly an amazing man. So Ben Kiley was very important. Hi.
My mother's family is from Clifton.
Oh, right.
And I've stayed at the Alpaca Grand.
The hotel? It's a
So my grandfather came over here, it must have been born around that time, I think, he came over.
right. But then they have a. Did you see the memorial there? They have a great memorial there.
For the,
Yeah. Well.
for Alcock.
Yeah, but still in Ireland. I mean, up until recently, we didn't really know who Alcock and Brown was, and everybody thought that it was.
Hoteliers.
Yeah. But now I think we're celebrating our history just a little bit more. But who was the guy who did it in 27? Yeah, but everybody thought that was him who did it first. So of course, he did the first solo transatlantic, non-stop transatlantic flight. But these guys were the first ones to actually do it. Sir?
I think you began your talk by saying that the writing process for you was one of discovery. I think you said that.
Absolutely.
Something around that. So
Right.
I guess my question for you is, in this book, what was the biggest surprise or biggest discovery that you had as you wrote it?
The biggest discovery I had was that I thought that I was going to celebrate Douglas at first. I thought he was this magnificent person, and then I began to have very contradictory feelings about the fact that he didn't speak out about what was happening in Ireland about the famine. And then I disliked him. I really intensely disliked him for a long time, and I wasn't able to deal with it. It was very hard for me. I was in a sort of a shock about this, and then I began to discover, but that's okay. You know, we don't want these cardboard figures. We are complicated. We are a stew. You know, Whitman said, you know, do I contradict myself? Well, very well then, I contradict myself. And when I could acknowledge that was a big discovery for me. And then I liked him again. And now, I mean, he is one of my great heroes. I mean, anybody who studies American history knows that so much of what, say, Martin Luther King has done and other came from Frederick Douglass. Women's rights. He was the first one to champion women's rights publicly, and he was just way ahead of his time. That was a real discovery for me, that the character could shift and change in that sort of way. Thank you. Over here.
I want to apologise for being English.
No, that's honestly, it's not your fault.
That's how I feel about it.
No.
I wanted to know why it is, and maybe you can tell me why it is that most Irish people can tell a wonderful story. Is there some reason why you are so good at it?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. Can I tell you that when I was a kid growing up, all my heroes were English. They were all soccer players and things like that. And so you know, and we have all these contradictions in relationship to our the history that we have together. But all my heroes were English. Why do we tell good stories? I mean, somebody told me once it was because it was a Catholic country, and you only have a week between confessions, and you have to make up something. I think that's kind of funny, you know. I know I used to lie in my confession all the time. Also, our language was taken from us, and that was very important. To have your language taken away from you, and to have a language foisted upon you, and then you have to. Joyce said he was going to use the language in a more profound and agile way than anybody had before, and take it and almost use it as a tool of violence. But also, it has to do with music, I think, as well. Music and timing and rhythm. And we had a lot of time to and I heard somebody say, and drinking. Did I hear somebody say that? Yeah. Yeah, perhaps that has something to do with it too.
Is it something to do with the social life, the fact that...
Certainly it was something to do with the social life. We had Shanakees who would go from town to town, and so this person would be a storyteller, and he would go into a town or into a house, and he would inhabit that house for 10 days, and people would bring food, and and he would tell a story, and it would go on and on and on, and he was probably one of the most revered in the society. So that would be part of it too. Yes. Yeah. Great. At the back here.
Burst into the first person at the end with Hannah.
Right.
Can you explain why?
I can explain why. So the book has a sort of mathematical intention. There's 3 male narratives, 3 female narratives, as I said. I wanted one story at the end. There's 7 real sections of the book. I wanted it to feel as if she had narrated the whole book. It's not true, of course, but I wanted it to feel that way, that she had all the histories operating inside her. And she just sort of suggested herself to me as that sort of character who needed to tell the story of Ireland and America, because she's really both, and she's coming together. So that's it's as simple as that, and as complicated as that too. Sir?
So I have a question that goes along that exact point. In Let the Great World Spin, when you were doing each of the stories, you really got into the voice and into the head of the characters in each of the sections. And then in this book, it's almost like just, there's one tone throughout. It's almost like a poetic. It's almost like a poem.
Well,
And in Dancer, you're much more mechanical. How did you evolve in writing, and how did you sort of like change the way you would narrate the different stories and the perspective and the voice?
it's all about, for me, it's all about language, and then language finds its form. The way I would compare it is that, like, you know, Van Morrison goes into a studio and he finds it. He doesn't know what it is beforehand, but that saxophone, you never bring in your saxophone too early, you know. And he gets it. And being a writer is a bit like being a musician, that you look for the right rhythm and feel for that particular song, or that particular album, and so I was aware of the like short clipped sentences that I'm doing in TransAtlantic. I was aware that I was pulling back on some of the language and pulling back on some of the poetry. And whereas in Dancer, there's a whole section, like there's one section that's 40 pages long without a full stop, you know, and it's all a bit crazy. That was supposed to reflect a cocaine infused night on the town in New York. So the language finds the form, and the language also finds the plot. In fact, I think of all the only thing that really matters when you're writing is to get the music and the language correct, and the plot and everything else generally will take care of itself. Over here, sure.
I discovered you first through Fishing the Songdogs River.
Oh wow, thank you. That's my first book.
I thought that was wonderful.
Thank you.
But my question is, another great Irish modern writer I discovered called Kevin Barry.
Kevin Barry, wonderful.
Wonderful writer, and I wonder why he hasn't become more successful.
Oh, I think he's pretty successful. He got the front page of the New York Times Book Review. People are really talking about him. He's a brilliant reader. If I go to a festival with Kevin Barry, I talk to the organisers and say, I want to read before Kevin Barry. Because he is so brilliant and is so funny and writes so beautifully, and you just do not want to go after him, you know. Check him out. It's City of Bohane. Bohane is really fantastic.
What about Sebastian Barry?
Sebastian Barry. Now, Sebastian would sing a song tonight. Yeah.
World War I stories.
Yeah. Sebastian has a new book out. A gentleman, something. What is it? Anyway, Temporary Gentleman. Thank you very much. And he's wonderful. He's also a really decent. It's also very interesting sometimes to meet your heroes, and what's particularly nice is if you like your heroes. And Sebastian, I will tell you a little story. I was in Dublin in a pub as a young writer. He'd just come out with his first book called Engine of Owlite, which is not even available anymore. And I'd read it, and I saw him in a pub, and he was surrounded by all these girls. They're from the theatre, and I was like, that's the life I want, you know. And I sat at the counter and watched him, and I said, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And I finally plucked up enough courage to say what I wanted to say, and he walked out of the place. And I didn't meet him for another 10 years. And I told him the story. He says, why didn't you tell me? He says, nobody had read that book at that stage, except maybe those girls that were surrounding him. But he's great.
Time for 2 more questions.
Okay, I feel so bad because I see more hands.
I'll meet him afterward and ask your question then if you don't have the time to ask
Okay,
it tonight.
sir.
Shortly after the Friday agreement, Mr. Mitchell came here to Darien to the Woodway Club and gave a speech. And you mentioned earlier about the importance of community work, and I hope my memory of his speech is correct, but if I remember, he said that when he went over there, he did discover how important it was going to be to listen,
Right.
but that he was a bit shocked and impressed, having listened to many a story in front of him by someone who was very excited and offended and just was living a certain incident like if it had happened to him. And then he said he's describing something that happened 200 years ago.
Exactly.
And his conclusion was that America, and the question is, do you think is that the claim is somewhat correct? And that is, Americans don't have that sense of history. We don't have that the continuum, the immediacy that he seemed to have had to deal with in this 700-year conflict.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of. I think it might be a good thing that we don't cling. Yeah, it would be nice to be able to remember things and pay close attention to the past and the good stuff.
He was having this experience.
Yeah, but you know, Senator Mitchell also said, he said Ireland is the only place that he's ever come across where, you know, like, people will go 100 miles out of their way to receive an insult. You know, we love that sort of stuff. It's like, it's great. You know that the old joke is like that there's, it's Irish Alzheimer's. You forget everything except the grudge. You know? It's true. We have a question here, and then we have one at the back. So I was going to go. Sorry, I'm going to do two more.
That's okay. How did you get over the terror of starting to write this book originally in the beginning?
That's a good question. How did you get over the terror of writing this book? I mean, the simple answer is that really you have to put your arse in the seat, and that's it. I mean, and I know there are kids still here, right? Can I say a bad word? Okay, just close your ears. A friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Alexander Heyman, talks about the writing process, and he says some very wise words. He says, "It's all shit until it isn't." In other words, it's like you have to work. You have to be there in the seat. You have to be available for it. Like, so writing is not, Dr. O says, writing is not planning, writing is not outlining, writing is not anything. Writing is writing. Writing is sitting down and fighting it. And even if you only get like 10 words in a day over the course of 12 hours, especially if you only get 10 words, then you've done a good day's work. So it's about, there's a certain amount of athleticism to it too, because you have to be, you know, like, tough, mentally tough, and a little bit physically tough to be able to sit in that chair and fight it. So, yeah. And we had one question from the back that we were going to do. Where was that hand? Okay, from the very back.
Many nights, Patty Riley played night with Joe Hurley.
Aha.
How did you two cross paths, and are you collaborating on?
Yeah, Joe Hurley is a wonderful musician, and we wrote a song together for "Let the Great World Spin." And he's one of those fantastic sort of agile linguistic masters when he's messing with songs. His songs sound like the Pogues, and I haven't seen Joe in about 6 months or so. But I always like to collaborate with musicians. I just did a song with a group called TransAtlantic, actually, with a group called Clonid, that you might know. And it just came out on their most recent album. So I love you know, doing the whole music thing. If Joe was here, he would have sung for you. I'm sorry I didn't. Thank you very, very much.